Good evening. I hope that everybody is doing well. Our scripture reading for this evening is going to come out of the book of Revelation. We started a couple weeks ago in looking at the middle of Revelation. We went into chapter 12 and 13 with Matt and Jonathan and explored a little bit of the imagery there of the dragon and the woman, and kind of looking as to what those things might mean as kind of an apocalyptic vision of what's going on in the book. And so what I thought we would do this evening is, rather than starting at the first, which might seem like a logical thing to do, or rather than jumping around still, what I want to do is actually begin with the end. Uh, my sister-in-law, whenever she reads a book, she always flips to the very end of the book to see what's going to happen in the conclusion. That way she'll know if she's going to really enjoy this book or not, and also to kind of know what the ending is, if it's a happy ending, those kinds of things. Well, in some ways, the book of Revelation is written with the end in mind. It is a book that has had all sorts of difficulties in its translation and interpretation over the years. Its interpretation has been kind of turned in probably the last 150 years or so into something that is this sort of predictive text, where we are so fearful of what might be happening around us, and we're trying to dig through the clues as to figure out what's going on around us in light of this book. Well, that's one way to interpret the book. But this book has been interpreted over the life of the church in very different ways than that. In fact, the church read this as a book of hope. It was the living songbook of the New Testament, kind of like the Psalms were for what we would call the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And it is full of yes, crazy imagery and all sorts of just wild things that are going on in it. But there's a hopeful note that is strung throughout. And so, in order to be able to interpret this text and be able to read it within its context, what I want to do is begin with the end. That way we can have a sense of where this text is going. And the way that we end up getting there will be important. So it needs to be in line with that whole overall vision. We're not always sure of all the details in between here and there, but we can trust that God is taking and bringing us all along the way. So I want to start in Revelation chapter 21, starting in verse 1. And it reads this: Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. And then he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. He said to me, It is done, or it is finished. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty, I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. Those who are victorious will inherit all this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of seven last plagues came and said to me, Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. It shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel. Well, in this particular story, at the very end, we've got Revelation 21, and then 22 is the ending chapter. So we're kind of right almost at the very tail end of the book of Revelation. But in Revelation 21, we see this actually very beautiful imagery of a ceremony that's happening. Now, it's a kind of a surprising ceremony. Again, we've sort of imagined this book to be a book quite fearful, a book that's full of just terrible imagery and ferocity and just kind of uncertainty. But here we have this really beautiful image of Jerusalem and heaven and earth, and it's something that is transpiring in this moment that is maybe perhaps unexpected. What we've stumbled upon in chapter 21 is a wedding ceremony. Heaven and earth are being brought together in the kind of union that happens between spouses when they're married. When they are brought together, they become one flesh, as Scripture talks about. This heaven and earth is being transformed in a moment. There is a new heaven and a new earth, which doesn't mean that God scraps the old heaven and old earth. It does say they've passed away. There is a sort of death that happens. But we also see in this particular passage resurrection. In fact, think about Jesus. Jesus, who was crucified in his body, dead and buried for 3 days, so dead, and yet brought to life by the power of the Spirit through God the Father. Jesus is raised to new life, resurrection life, and there's something that is both changed, transformed, and something that is still identifiable about Jesus. When Jesus walks through walls to meet with the disciples, we know that this body has been changed in some way, but it's still a body. As Jesus meets with them, he shows them the wounded hands, the hole in his side. He even tells Thomas, touch it and see and believe. So this is a real body. In fact, when Jesus says Mary's name, then she knows it's Jesus, but it's not quite in evidence in the moment that she sees him, or when the disciples are walking on the road to Emmaus and they're talking about Jesus and something's burning inside them. And then when he breaks the bread, their eyes are open to who it is. So there's something that is distinctly different, new, changed, transformed, transfigured. But at the same time, there's something that is still identifiable, something that is still recognizable in the body of Jesus. The same thing is true, I think, for this heaven and earth that are being changed, transformed, transfigured by the power of God. This is a moment where heaven and earth have maybe passed away, however you want to frame that, but it is also experiencing in the moment of death, resurrection. God does this new thing in heaven and earth. There is a transformation. And not only that, not only is there a transformation of these two things, but they are being brought together. They are being joined together. There is the Lord's Prayer. We pray this quite often. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In the person of Jesus, we see both heaven and earth being brought together in a way that is no longer separated out. And Jesus is the first fruits, the first seed of this new creation. And at the tail end of Revelation, what we see is the fulfillment of this initial act and promise that's given in Jesus, that heaven and earth, humanity and God, will no longer be divided out, but will be brought together. There will be a marriage ceremony, what we've sometimes called the wedding banquet of the Lamb. Heaven and earth are being brought together. God and humanity are being brought together. The church and Christ are fully brought together. There is a union that is happening. And so what John sees happening in this vision is this new heaven, new earth coming. And one of the things that he notes is that there is no longer any sea. Now, for those of us that like to walk the beaches and walk along the oceans or sea or whatever, who love water, this may actually sound like really bad news. But John is using sea as a metaphor for chaos. If you remember Genesis 1, God's Spirit was hovering over the waters. Now, the waters in that imagery are waters of chaotic disorganization where life is impossible. If you remember the disciples as they are going out on the boat without Jesus and also with Jesus in the boat, there's two stories. And the storm builds up and the waters are about to capsize the boat, and there's all sorts of fear and chaos. The lake was not a safe place, and you didn't want to be out there. There was all sorts of folklore about spirits being out on the water, especially dark and at night, and when storms would come up suddenly. It was a fearful thing. So when there is no longer any sea in this new heaven and new earth, it's not saying that there's no water. It's saying chaos is no longer reigning. There is no chaos. God has brought this new creation into fullness, and chaos no longer reigns. And so he goes on. He says, I saw the holy city, this new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven. Well, that's really interesting because Jerusalem is on earth, right? So in the mind of John, there is a correlation between what is on earth and what is in heaven. That there is something that is reflected on earth that is in heaven, and vice versa. And so here, John sees the new Jerusalem being brought down out of heaven onto earth. And Jerusalem was also the center of God's presence for the Jewish people. It was the sign that God was with them, this city of peace. And so for Jerusalem to come down from heaven to earth, this is a sign that God's presence is fully manifested here in this moment, in this place, being brought together again, heaven and earth. Jerusalem was that place, especially in the temple, that was a sort of touch point, a thin place, as some people would say, between heaven and earth. Specifically the altar, the Holy of Holies was that place where you couldn't go because it was so sacred, except maybe once a year, and the high priest would do that. But now the high priest has become Jesus, and Jesus has brought heaven and earth together, and so now there is no need for that dividing wall, that curtain to separate. Heaven and earth have been brought together. It's beautiful imagery. And in the middle of this wedding ceremony, this ongoing wedding ceremony that John is illustrating, he says that Jerusalem came out of heaven, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband, who is Christ. And then he hears this loud voice saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and God will dwell with them. They will be God's people, and God will be with them and be their God. So here, even in the promise of Jesus, Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. God has put on flesh and dwelt among us. And now, in this last scene in Revelation 21, this is the fulfillment of all those initial hopes that were in Jesus, that God would be fully present, just as God was fully present with Adam and Eve in the initial garden. We'll get to that a little bit later in Revelation 22, talking about a garden. But here, God is pleased to dwell with humanity, and humanity with God. There is no longer any separation, but this is being brought together in wholeness and in hope. And the beauty of this is that God is so present that God will even wipe the tears from our eyes. Now, notice that there's still tears. That's interesting. Maybe these are tears of joy. But God is so present that God wipes the tears from our eyes. And even more hope. There is no more death. There's no more mourning or crying or pain. For the old order of things has passed away. Death has been put to death. And God has made life abundant. And then he hears another voice. John hears another voice. And he hears it coming from the throne, and it says, I am making everything new. And then he tells John to write this down because this is trustworthy and true. So this whole imagery in in Revelation at the very end of things is that God is working towards this project. You could say it's sort of like a renovation of a house. You go into a house, if you've ever seen a DIY, a do-it-yourself, show, where they go in and this house is just dilapidated, it's broken down, it's run down. You just look at it and think, who can do anything with this? And you kind of get that idea that when you're reading the Revelation story, there's all sorts of just chaos and dysfunction and brokenness. And you look at the house and go, how can anybody do anything with this? But the master carpenter, the master architect comes in and begins to slowly change and transform things so that you may recognize the old house. The bones are still there, but God has done this transformational work that has made it a totally different house, though there is something still similar about it. So he goes on and says he's making everything new, not replacing everything, making it new, transforming it, changing it, transfiguring it. And so he says this, it is finished. Now it's really interesting because those are exact words that Jesus utters from the cross as he gives up his spirit and breathes it out into all the creation. So in the initial point of Jesus's crucifixion, where he breathed out the spirit, the ruach, like in Genesis 1, out into the world of chaos, there was a transformational moment. The world was shook in that moment. And resurrection obviously transforms all of those situations of the crucifixion. But Jesus said in that moment, it is finished. The work of God was done. In that initial moment on the cross, Jesus has initiated the planting of a seed that will now burst forth in new creation realities for all the world. And here, at the very culmination of things, those same words are uttered by God. It is finished. I am the beginning and the last. That's Alpha and Omega. That's the beginning and ending letters of the Greek alphabet. Alpha and Omega, beginning and end. God is all in all. And to the thirsty, God will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. You may remember the story from John 4, the woman at the well, where she has come at a moment where nobody else will be at the well. But she meets this man, Jesus, and he begins to talk with her. And as she is going along with this conversation and questioning whether he should be talking to her because he is a Jew and a male, Jesus ignores that and still has this conversation with her. She has gone there because she's embarrassed. She is a laughing stock in her community. And Jesus recognizes this is about her. She's gone in the middle of the day. Nobody goes in the middle of the day to get water. They do that early in the morning when it's still cool. But she's done it so that she can avoid the water cooler talk at the office, so to speak. He says, I will give you water and you will never thirst again. And she says, well, show me this water so that I may drink, thinking that she's going to just avoid all of life's problems. Well, Jesus says, if you know me, if you come to me, I will be the one who gives you water. And he begins to tell her everything that she has done and tells her that there's a different way of being in the world. There's a different life that's available to her. And she finds that this life and this water that Jesus offers is refreshing, it's new, and it's life-giving. And here, Jesus is offering that same kind of drink to us, that God will give water, the life-giving water of the Spirit, of relationship with God and one another without end. And so for those who are victorious, now don't think that God's telling you, you have to just get your stuff together and you have to make it happen. That's not what he's saying. For those who have persevered, for those who have drank of this water and continued to be faithful to the calling that God has given them, despite the persecutions and difficulties and challenges. For those who are victorious, their inheritance is that they are children of God, that they are part of this household, that they are brought into the fold, and they are part of this larger house that God is building. If you remember John 14, God says, I've gone to prepare a place for you. And so the way that this sort of story ends is this beautiful picture of God's redeeming work, heaven and earth being brought together in a marriage of a union where God and humanity is no longer separated out. And if that's the whole trajectory of the story, that's a pretty hopeful note to end on. Not a fearful note, not wondering how or what is going to transpire and how we're going to get there, but rather the story of Revelation is this ongoing narration of how God is even making the chaotic places in this world be changed and transformed to this one end, that God is going to bring it to a place where everything will be made new. All things will be made new. And God's very self, will dwell among us. I hope that this has been a blessing to you. Love and appreciate you. Hope that the peace of Christ will be with you in these days. If you have any questions or anything that I can help answer, would love to just connect with you about these kinds of things. Blessings, and I hope you have a great day.